This video was sponsored by Blinkist.
Hey! Welcome to another video. We interrupt your normally scheduled programming of woodworking how-tos and boat building to bring you something a little different. So the other day, I was watching my 5.5-year-old play with Legos, and I was thinking, it's getting close to Christmas. Maybe this year, along with his regular store-bought presents, I could try and build him something. And my eye got focused on this. A little tiny Lego man. And I had this idea of maybe, just maybe, I could replicate this out of wood. But not this size. I'm talking make it bigger. So that's what I'm gonna try and do. Now this is one of those tricky videos that I'm always a little hesitant to film because I don't know if this is gonna work. I have no plan, I just know what I want the end result to look like. And I also know that I'm gonna try and do the entire thing out of this scrap 4x4 piece of black walnut that has just been laying around my shop forever. So I'm gonna start cutting this thing up and try and make a working Lego man that actually comes apart, articulates, moves, all that jazz out of wood. This is it. Don't get scared now.
Snow, red sky, reach out for
The first thing I had to do was start cutting down that giant piece of black walnut. Now, if you're wondering why I'm using this chop saw and not my Festool, it's because my Festool's only a 10-inch, and this walnut, well, it's a beefy boy. So I needed all 12 inches of that blade. As I mentioned before, I really had no plan going into this. I had no drawings, no dimensions. I was just gonna eyeball my way through this. But I decided early on that the first thing I wanted to do was try and make the head. I figured if I got the head right, I could kinda gauge the rest of the body based on the head. So I took one of the blocks over to my lathe and I just started removing material until I was left with what kind of looked like a Lego man head. Then I took my newly turned block over to the bandsaw and trimmed off all the excess pieces. I sanded it flush with the disc sander, and then I drilled a hole in the top because that's what a Lego man's head looks like, and I drilled a hole in the bottom. Voila, the starts of a Lego man. I cleaned it up a little bit on my oscillating benchtop sander, and I was well on my way. Kind of. The head might not be quite right, but I'll figure that out later. Then I needed to glue some of my smaller blocks together to make bigger blocks. Typical woodworker. Cut things smaller and then glue them back together. I guess even with the Lego man, you can't quite get away from the normal routine. Those blocks would make up the body and the legs of my Lego fella. So while those dried, I decided to start working on the arms. So I took one of the blocks and I cut it in half over on the bandsaw, and then I planed each half down until they were perfectly even and about the thickness of a giant Lego man. I don't know, I'm just making this up. And then I just traced out what I thought looked like an arm of said Lego man onto one of the blocks. Yeah, that'll do. Then it was back over to the bandsaw to roughly cut out my arm shape. The arm of the Lego man. I'm not cutting out my arm on the bandsaw. I never recommend that behavior in the wood shop. With my first arm shape cut out, I cleaned it up on the oscillating sander, and then I used it as a template to trace out my second arm. And then of course I repeated the same steps on that arm until I had two arms that were exactly the same size. Next I had to drill little holes in the shoulder joint area as well as the wrist area to hook the arms to the, well, speaking of arms, get your frickin' arm out of the way, Jason. Gosh, who taught you how to film? Anyways, I had to drill some holes to hook the hands in and hook the arms to the body. Then after staring at the little Lego man for a while, I decided that they were much too square, so I decided to give them a little more of a rounded shape, simply using a round over bit on the, what is that thing called? Router, that's it. Until they looked, you know, much more Lego-y. And what's an arm without a hand? So I decided to start working on the Lego man hands themselves. Now I went back and forth on exactly how to do this. I was afraid this would be a weak point in the construction. I am building this out of wood, and those flimsy little Lego hands might just snap when my son plays with it. So I decided to employ a few different tactics to make the hands a little stronger. My idea was to carve the hands out of solid walnut and then add some laminated strips of walnut to the hands themselves to increase the strength and durability. So I cut some thin strips of walnut, and I just decided to cook it like spaghetti in a pot of boiling water. No, really, I just threw the strips in boiling water and cooked them till they were limp like spaghetti. I folded the now steamed pieces of walnut over a little piece of full round until they were pretty close to the exact shape that I was going for my Lego man hands. Once I got a few bent around the full round, I just added a clamp to keep them in that position, and I set them aside to dry. I'll come back to these a little bit later on. By the time I was done fiddling around with my hands and arms, my Lego man hands and arms, my 2 blocks were all dry, so I took them out of clamps and I started working on the legs. Now I decided to do both legs at once. That way I could shape them in one giant block, and then once I got the correct shape, I could just cut it apart into 2 separate legs. So after running it a million times through the table saw, yes, I probably should have got a dado stack, but I'm lazy. You should know that from watching my other videos. It started to resemble Lego legs, but I still needed to round over the top portion. So I cut as much material as I could on the table saw, just running it through at various different angles until I started to get the general shape I was going for, kind of like this. And then I finished rounding it over with a combination of a couple different things, a block plane, a hand sander, and then finally I cleaned it all up with a chisel. Then, probably because I have no plan at all and I'm really ADD, I stopped working on the legs and went back to working on the hands. So the first thing I did to carve my actual hand pieces was cut a few chunks of walnut, and I put them on the lathe to lathe out. Someone just told me that lathing isn't what you call it. Turn the round part that fits into the wrist socket joint area. This was a little tricky because I'm not a great lathes-man, turner, lather, but I managed to get it to the right size so that it fit nice and snug. I didn't want the hands randomly falling out and scaring my child. Next, I started cutting out the rough shape of the actual hand. First, I removed as much material as I could on the bandsaw, and then using my oscillating spindle sander, I got that nice rounded internal profile of the young man's little claw. Next, it was time to strengthen it a little bit. So I removed my walnut spaghetti from the clamps after it had dried, and wouldn't you know, it was in the perfect shape to slide inside the clutches of young Mr. Lego Man. Just like that, see? My plan was to glue a few different strips in here, hoping that it would, strengthen his hand. So I cut off the excess material I didn't need over on the bandsaw, and then I started layering those pieces inside the prefabricated Lego hands using thickened epoxy in between each layer. My thought was also that the epoxy might give it a little extra strength. This is the first time I've ever made Lego hands, so I don't really know what I'm talking about, but it seemed like a good idea. This video was sponsored by Blinkist. I've recently discovered Blinkist, which is awesome because with filming videos, I don't always have enough time to listen to a full audiobook. But with Blinkist, I can just listen to its highlights and it only takes about 15 minutes. I like to listen to Blinkist while I sand stuff. They offer the best insights from over 3,000 nonfiction books condensed down for easy listening. See, here's what I look like listening to a normal full-length audiobook. And here's what I look like when I'm listening to Blinkist. You just get a lot more out of it really quick. It's pretty awesome. One of my favorite listens so far was the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I feel like I learned a lot and it only took me 19 minutes. They also have these things called shortcasts, which are like sped up podcasts. Beyond the to-do list is one of my favorites.
Blinkist is an awesome app. I highly recommend you check it out. You can do so by clicking the link in my video description. And the first 100 people to click that link are going to get unlimited access to Blinkist for a week. And if you decide you want a membership, you get 25% off after that. The 7-day trial is completely free and you can cancel at any time if you don't like it. But let's be serious, you're going to love it. Now, let's get back to building a Lego man.
With my Lego hands in clamps and waiting for that epoxy to dry, I decided to start working on a little detail piece that was bothering me. In the top of the real Lego man, there was this little Mercedes-Benz symbol shoved in his top notch there. See? Why Mercedes-Benz puts their logo in the top of a Lego man's head, I don't know, but I decided to do it, for authenticity. With that little detail out of the way, I began cutting down the general shape for my body. Now I couldn't cut all the way through this giant block in the table saw, so I cut partway through the block with the table saw, finished it on the bandsaw, and then cleaned it up with the block plane, followed by the random orbit sander. And voila. Is it voila or voila? Anyways, because I like to jump all over the place, I abandoned working on my body and I started working on my legs again. Now the legs are the most complicated part because they have to move, and not just move, they have to move in a couple different ways to move the body and each leg individually. So I had to make a little hinge that is part of the actual Lego man. I started by cutting a board on the table saw using a cove cut method to get a nice coved out channel down the center of the board. Next, I cut the board to the right width so that it would sit perfectly on top of my prefabricated legs. Well, close enough anyways. Then I cut it down to the right length so that it would match up with the pre-cut body. Then I took it over to the table saw again, and using a crosscut sled, I cut out a little channel down the middle of this piece to house my little pin holder thingy-mabob that would hold a pin and connect each leg from left to right. Then using the pre-shaped leg block, I set it in the little coved out channel and I used it as a template to trace the general shape that I would need for my little underwear pin holder Lego piece. Once I had the shape generally where I wanted it to be, I roughly cut it out on the bandsaw. Now it was finally time to cut my giant leg block into 2 separate legs, but I had to account for the material in the middle that was going to be made up by that underwear hinge thing I was working on. So after marking out how much I needed to cut off to account for the hinge, I cut down each individual leg and I set them in my underwear hinge just to see if I was at least on the right track. Then I had to drill some big honking holes in the back of the legs for 2 reasons really. One, because that's what a real Lego man has on his butt, and 2, because I needed access into the back of the leg so that I could fiddle around with that pin that connects the legs to the underwear to the other leg. Speaking of those pins, I next had to drill some holes on the inside of each leg to house those pins. Oh yeah, I need pins too. So back to the lathe to turn down, not lathe down, some more pin stock. Now here's where I started having some issues. It wasn't as simple as just inserting a pin into each leg, going through that piece of underwear, and calling it good. Because there was no way to lock that pin in place without locking the legs in a position. I wanted this to work like a real Lego man. So if I glued the pin to both legs, well, both legs would have to move together at the same time, and that just wasn't going to cut it. So after giving it some thought, I took the pin out and I turned 2 little notches on each side of the pin. Then, by inserting the pin back into the leg, through the underwear, and into the other leg, I could access those little notches through my giant holes in the butt and insert 2 little blocks. Now these blocks sat down into those pre-turned little notches, locking the legs in place, but still allowing each leg to spin freely. Yeah, I know, that was a lot. And it took me more than the 30 seconds I show in this video to come up with it, I assure you. But in the end, it was actually the perfect solution and worked almost exactly like I wanted it to. The one issue left to figure out was there wasn't quite enough tension on that top piece, so kind of flopped around a little bit. And I knew once I got the weight of his upper body on there, that just wasn't going to cut it. So where the pin passed through that middle piece of underwear, I drilled 2 small holes on either side of the pin, and I inserted 2 little plugs. By leaving the plugs long and slowly sanding them down, I was able to fine-tune the tension caused by that pin running through that middle piece of underwear, making sure that I had a very nice, tight fit and giving me the friction I wanted to keep his upper body in place when he was standing erect. I said standing, and he's a Lego man, so he can't really stand. He's not a real person. Anyways, with my legs now figured out and confident they would work the way I wanted them to, I jumped back to working on my upper body. So I did a few push-ups and pull-ups, and then I started drilling holes in the Lego man's upper body. First, I had to drill out the holes for the arms to connect to. Now, I had some leftover pre-turned dowel from doing the legs, and so this worked perfectly to connect the arms to the body. I made sure that they had a nice snug fit into the body itself, and then I would glue them in place into the actual arms. Hey, I just said I was going to do it, and now look, you can see me doing it. Movie magic. With my arms all ready to go, I had to start working on connecting my head. So yes, I had to go back over to the lathe and turn some more round stock. This time I turned a nice big beefy piece, because the one connecting the real Lego man's head on his body is a little bit beefier. Happy with the fit, I drilled out a corresponding sized hole into the top of the Lego man's body, and I glued it in place. I still think there's something wrong with his head though. It just doesn't look big enough, maybe? I don't know. I'll deal with that later. But for now, I was pretty happy with the progress thus far. I mean, he was really starting to look like a Lego man. Next, I had to figure out a way to connect his upper body to his lower body. So I took off part of my little underwear hinge, specifically the top plate, and after clamping it in place onto the upper body, I drilled 2 small pilot holes straight through the lower plate into the body. This just allowed me to get perfect alignment from that plate into the body itself. Then I drilled 2 small recesses into the top of the plate, and I drilled 2 deeper holes into the bottom of the body. You know, like a real Lego man. And you guessed it, back over to the lathe to turn some more round stock. Geez, there's a lot of turning in this video. Then I used my only screws in this entire project. I didn't like how shallow those recesses were on the top of the plate, and didn't just trust the glue with my 5-year-old banging it around all the time. So I glued and then I inserted a few screws from the bottom of the plate, which you won't see because, well, the legs are gonna completely hide them. By this time, the epoxy on my experimental Lego hands had set up, so I was ready to take those out of clamps and start shaping them. Right now they just look gross. So the first thing I did was cut off all the excess little bits of laminated strips that were hanging out either side of each hand. Then I cleaned them up the best I could over on the oscillating sander, and they looked kind of like this, roughly. See that nice layer of laminate inside his hand? Hopefully that'll do the trick. Then I set my hands aside and I glued my little underwear piece in place and let that sit. And I just couldn't get over this stinking head. It just looked way too small and I hated everything about it. So I just made a brand new one. Ah, much better. And with that, believe it or not, all my pieces were constructed. The only thing left to do was to sand everything thoroughly. Well, not really thoroughly because I'm giving this to a 5-year-old and he's not really going to care, but I sanded it until, it looked nice and clean. And I was ready to put it all together and see what he looked like. So I started by inserting my pin into my legs. I have to clamp it together to get it nice and tight and then insert those little pre-made blocks, and that completely assembles the legs. Then insert the hands, plop on the head, put the arms on the body, and insert the body into the legs, and you have yourself a Lego man. But I couldn't give my son a creepy, faceless Lego man. I mean, what kind of dad do you think I am? I might give him nightmares. So I drew out the rough shape of the Lego man onto some blue painter's tape, cut it out with an X-Acto knife, and hit it with a little black spray paint. Then I took the tape off to see what kind of monstrosity I had created. It looked pretty good, but it just didn't look quite right. I thought it might be a little too shiny, so I hit it with a little 150 sandpaper to dull it down, and I cleaned it up a little bit with a chisel. And then I remembered that Lego men have this little white dot in each one of their eyes. So just by hand with a little paintbrush, I added the little white dot and cleaned it up with a chisel. Then I thought about carving out the word Lego on his chest, but I didn't want to get in trouble for copyright infringement, so I decided to just brand my logo on it. Product placement. Everywhere my son carries this Lego man, I'm bound to get hundreds of thousands of sales. At this point, all that needed to be done was for him to be oiled up. But I just couldn't wait any longer. I had to show it to my son. I had been keeping him out of my wood shop for 2.5 days now, and he just couldn't take it anymore. So I decided to give him a little sneak peek before I put the oil on. Okay, stand right here. Okay, stand up. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Yes. I love it!
What is it?
A Lego man. I love it. Thank you.
But look, it actually works.
Thank you. Hey, can you make a whole Lego world?
You want me to make a whole Lego world? Yeah, let's get to work. Come on. Well, that plan backfired. Now for the oil.
Well, hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. That was sure a hoot and a half. Now, if you're not doing so already, go follow me on Instagram, Facebook, comment down below, like this video, click that little notification bell, and subscribe. Whew. I think that was everything. Oh yeah, check out some of these other videos around here. I'm gonna go play with this.